I want to welcome everybody for joining us for our Pride Month Community Conversation. My name is Jacqueline Freeman, and I am the Senior Director and Special Advisor to the President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers. A couple of housekeeping details that we're going to cover before we actually begin our event with our speaker. First, everybody, all of our guests are going to be muted so that we don't have any background noise and feedback during the event. Our speaker is going to speak for approximately 30 minutes and does have a presentation as part of their speaking event. Following about 30 minutes of the presentation, we're going to have a brief question and answer, and that'll happen at approximately 12:30. And for our guests, in order to participate, you can put questions in chat, and you can also use the raised hand feature. And very briefly, I would like to hand it over to our President and Dean, James McGrath, just to welcome you as well to our community event.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Preston Mitchum, for being with us here today. My pronouns also he, him, and his. And it's big thanks to Jackie for being able to contact you and make this happen today. She already mentioned her title. She is the Special Advisor to the President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and she does an amazing job. We're so happy to have her here. So let me not take up any more of your time, and let me turn it over back to Jackie for your official introduction.
All right, thank you, James. Preston Mitchum, pronouns he and him, is a Black queer attorney. He's an advocate and an activist hailing from Dayton, Ohio, and currently living in Washington, D.C. He is the founder and CEO of PDM Consulting, a multi-purpose consulting firm focused on the power of Black people, LGBTQ people, and young people. The rest of his bio is in the link because it is very long. But again, WMU Cooley, we welcome you, Preston Mitchum, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm welcome and invitation to speaking to you all today. I know the presentation is being pulled up. Can we go? Thank you. All right, great. Thank you. So again, this month is Pride Month, and so I'm really excited to be speaking before you all to discuss a brief history of Pride Month, what it means, what it entails, what is the historical overview and landscape of Pride Month, and then also discuss some of the anti-LGBTQ legislation as we have it today. Some of this will be a look back and a look ahead in terms of some of the anti-LGBTQ bills we've seen popping up from 2018, 19 through now even. And then of course, what's next? What are tangible ways to take action? How can law students, lawyers, and those in the legal profession do to make sure that they're really speaking up on behalf of LGBTQ youth and Pride Month and beyond? Next, please. Just a little bit about me, just because I find it important to know who you're speaking to, though you do have the bio there. I am a Black and queer attorney, activist, and advocate. I always find it really important for me to start off with the identities that really mean a lot to me, because they shape not only who's before you, but really the way I go about my work, the way I go about centering the communities that I think are oftentimes not centered in mainstream media. And also, even when it comes to legislative attacks, even though many of these communities are the first to be attacked, they're certainly the last ones to be defended. And so that's why it's important for me to really discuss the identities that really make up who I am, the intersections that make me who I am, and the work that I do. I also really find it important to discuss things related to theory of changes. If you happen to Google the definition of theory of change, it is gobbledygook, right? It is really confusing, and it's so distant from what many of us may know to be. But really, when I think of theory of change, it's as simple as thinking about the communities who you want to center the most. Think about the actual change, the people who you see actually not being grounded in the solutions, even though they may be first harmed by social, political, or economic systems. And last but certainly not least, I am from the Midwest with roots in the South. which is really important to me because if you actually really look at the landscapes of hardest hit populations, be it Black folks, queer folks, trans and non-binary people, women and girls, among others, they usually predominate in the South and the Midwest, and there are many reasons for that. Even when we look back to the Affordable Care Act, in which governors have expanded, even now, ACA benefits to its residents, we see that the only places in the entire country that does not have things related to benefits from the Affordable Health Care Act predominate in the South and the Midwest, especially now in the South. When we look at the legislation popping up, in terms of who's being attacked by policymakers, among other community members and among other elected officials, we see that the vast majority predominate in the South and the Midwest. And so also connects to me being an attorney, activist, and an advocate, and certainly connects to my theory of change of how to support the people who are the most historically discriminated against and the most historically marginalized. Next slide. And you can probably click another one as well, because that one, Jackie already discussed, a consulting firm that I have founded and am the CEO of. So next, yes, thank you. So this takes me to today's objectives. I have 3 objectives in mind in the discourse. And so the first is really, again, to provide a brief history and overview of the events which lead and have led to the creation of Pride Month. Secondly, it is about this past and current year's anti-LGBTQ attacks, meaning the legislative landscape. And finally, tangible ways to take action to support LGBTQ youth, really people, but a lot of the attacks that we're seeing, and as you'll see, are really against LGBTQ plus youth. Next slide, please. To start here, nothing is wrong with being LGBTQ. Something is wrong with how society responds. I've done tons of work in my career, a lot of it on reproductive health rights and justice and on supporting LGBTQ youth. And one of the things that I found, particularly at my past work at the Trevor Project, is that you'll see tons of data and research on LGBTQ youth having higher rates of suicidal ideations, attempts, and sometimes, unfortunately, completions. And sometimes that does not tell the whole story, because for many people looking at that data, unfortunately, they're thinking, many of them have admitted to thinking that, well, there must be something that's inherently happening or inherently wrong with LGBTQ people, with LGBTQ youth. But it's the exact opposite that's true. There are many LGBTQ people, even if they don't use that terminology, who really want to be confident in who they are, but they understand just how ostracized, stigmatized, criminalized LGBTQ people are. So for some of them, they stay in this proverbial closet, so to speak. And for many others, even when they do come out or invite people into their personal lives, they're still met with a stigmatic and oftentimes visceral responses. And so I find it very important to always start with nothing is wrong with being LGBTQ. The problem that we're solving for and the problem that's being identified is how society responds. How is that society is responding to LGBTQ people? How do we create a braver or more safer, in many instances, spaces for people to show up and be fully authentic in who they are? So let's remember this throughout this entire presentation is the societal response that we're solving for, not inherently solving for an LGBTQ person. Next, please. And next, please. So Pride Month, a month of resistance. And so Pride Month, what we now know to be a celebration of queer, trans, and non-binary people every June since 1970, did not begin with corporations spending money on floats at parades. It didn't begin with, obviously, like pride rainbows being on shirts and buttons, among other things. It began with and by community. And contrary to what people may now see in mainstream media, it started as a protest specifically against police violence. And Pride in its purest form was a riot. It is, it was, and it should always be recognized as a riot, though we can also recognize the many facets that Pride now has attached and associated with it, and why that riot was necessary in the first place. And that's really personal for me, and it's something I discuss quite extensively in the chapter titled Queer as in Abolishing the Police, Criminal Legal Systems, and Black LGBTQ People in the book, The Black Agenda. As a Black queer man in America, I'll say I know far too well that law enforcement have only continued to hurt bodies like mine throughout history. And this is coupled with everything that we know about the reproductive health rights and justice movement and how it is paired with LGBTQ and racial justice movements. And that's true even after many reforms. And for me, I know that my queerness and my Blackness and the history tied to both are a place where we can all begin to really understand why we must dream of alternatives, why Pride and the protests and the riots were really important, especially for Black LGBTQ plus people during Pride Month. And that's especially true when we recognize that not only is June a celebration regarding and of and by LGBTQ people, it is also the time that we recognize the last freed people, the last freed Black people in the United States in Galveston, Texas, or what we know now to be Juneteenth. And so there is really a double connection that is being made around Black people and LGBTQ people regarding Pride Month and Juneteenth. I explore this a lot more in an article I wrote last year called My Juneteenth is Queer, My Pride is Black. And so when we really think about police and police marching with us now during the Pride parades and festivals throughout the country, there really is a decades-long history of over-policing of the LGBTQ community. And that's true irrespective of race. So much so that Pride began 1 year after the Stonewall riots. But if we start with the Stonewall riots, unfortunately, I think we're missing a lot of history that really led up to the Stonewall riots, and frankly, even before the first identified uprising on this slide here. So if we start with some of the bar raids, we know that in 1959, there was Cooper Donuts uprising. We know that in 1966, there was Compton's cafeteria riot. In 1967, there was a civil demonstration called the Black Cat Tavern. And then, of course, the Stonewall riots or uprisings in 1969. So it was a culmination, an amalgamation, if you will, of events, of uprisings, large and small, that really set the tone for why LGBTQ people were exhausted with law enforcement presence and really the invasion of what was then, or now even still, safer and braver spaces for us to commune and celebrate and have a cocktail with some of our LGBTQ friends. Next slide, please. So when we do a deeper dive, next slide, please. Thank you. No, there's a couple more. Perfect. All right. Now perfect. Okay. So Cooper Donuts uprising. And so a lot of this is important to note that until we got to the Stonewall riots in 1969, much of the uprisings that we saw were actually in the West Coast, in San Francisco and in Los Angeles in particular. So in 1959, we have the Los Angeles Police Department, and they often like the NYPD, unfortunately, they often targeted LGBTQ people through many laws at the time. So a lot of it was entrapment laws, intimidation laws, loitering laws, and through systems of violence. Police specifically targeted, of course, trans people, which I'm sure many of us see those connections today, but also a little bit more systemic through law and policy. A lot of times what they would do, quite frankly, is arrest people who just had a different perceived gender than what was identified on their license or on their state ID. And so a lot of it, several bars became known for doing this, known for snatching IDs, known for snatching driver's licenses, specifically of trans and non-binary people. And in an attempt to erode a lot of this, gay bars itself started discriminating against trans people because they just did not want many violations happening, right? Which we can also discuss some of the infighting of in LGBTQ communities itself. But that's another story, also this one. But nonetheless, to stay specifically here, police at the time really just came into this establishment and asked specific people for their ID based on looks, gender presentation, etc. And because of that, violence ensued. Once this violence ensued, of course, small uprisings and fightings began. Patrons got really fed up with everything that was happening, and there were several arrests made this night. And this is one of the first known and historically documented uprisings, though it was smaller, in Los Angeles, California. And again, this was 10 years before the Stonewall riots. Next slide, please. In the next slide, we learn a little bit more about Compton's cafeteria. In the slide itself, there was a dedication made in San Francisco and in Oakland in 2006 around the Compton cafeteria riots. And again, it was a small uprising, but it was really in response to violence and constant police harassment, specifically of drag queens and trans people. And that was specific to trans women more often than not. But this was the first one that marked the beginning of transgender activism, so many historians say, in San Francisco, California. Next slide, please. And again, as noted, the Black Cat Tavern, for many who was there, called it a civil demonstration more than they do a riot or a protest. But it was happening on New Year's Eve when really LGBTQ people were ringing in the New Year's. And when the flashing of the lights started happening, many just say they remember police swinging batons on them, hitting them out. And a couple people were actually knocked out and beaten unconscious who were patrons and a couple bartenders there. So we have this deep history already, years leading up to the Stonewall riots. The Black Cat Tavern itself was 2 years before the Stonewall riots. And so next slide, please. When we now have the Stonewall riots in June of 1969, we really start to hear the names of people like Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Miss Major Griffin Gracie, among others, who were alleged to have who threw the first brick to police when they were exhausted with the raids happening on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village in New York City. And that in itself, for many people, is the catalyst for the mainstream gay rights movements, but also larger, the LGBTQ plus movement, not only in the United States, but in many places around the world. So if we see, of course, we have many of these protests, uprisings, and I think it's really important to note that specifically for Stonewall riots, I think it's important to pluralize it because it was not just a moment in time. There are many who believe it was just one night of activism, of pushback, but George Matthew Johnson tells this story very well and included in a documentary about this, that it was many Black and Puerto Rican drag queens, trans women, non-binary folks, and queer folks who were fighting back for days after the June 28th initial catalyst. So it was an uprisings of events that really led to this moment. It was not just one moment. Next slide, please. Because it's Pride Month, I also think it's important to note my personal favorite hero and icon, Byron Rustin, who is a Black queer man who, for much of his life, until his death, frankly, he went unknown to many people by name. But he was a Black queer man who was a chief architect of the 1963 March on Washington and the right-hand person to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he was a rebel rouser and noted that he was a troublemaker, an angelic troublemaker, he would oftentimes say. So one of my favorite quotes is always, "We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers." And that is what I think about when I'm discussing these notions of civil unrest of civil demonstrations, sometimes not so civil unrest and civil demonstrations. I'm oftentimes reminded of a riot is a language of the unheard, is a protest is the language of the unheard. And when you get so many instances of silence, right, there's always going to be something, that moment that strikes the flame that makes communities react. And that's what we saw here time after time with these riots, with the protests, with the civil demonstrations, ultimately culminating 1 year after the Stonewall riots to what we now know as Pride Month. Next slide, please. It's also unfortunate that as we're celebrating Pride Month and as we are reminding ourselves of the joy, the resistance, the rightful indignation of the moments that led us to what we now know as Pride, we're also balancing that or juxtaposing that with a record anti-LGBTQ plus legislation across the country, state legislative attacks on LGBTQ youth. And this is where I find numbers to be incredibly important to tell the story. Next slide, please. So right now, if you look at, or even last year in 2022, when you think about the number of bills that we had, we saw more than 300 anti-LGBTQ bills be introduced across the United States, mostly in the South and the Midwest, and the vast majority, as Jackie alluded to earlier, targeting transgender and non-binary youth. And they are even still oftentimes in four categories. So sports bans, which we oftentimes have seen, largely starting with a women's swimmer named Leah, who a lot of attacks started happening because she won one race after losing several others. People finally said, you know what? This is now something that's going to continue to happen. If someone does 200 meets and they win one, that suddenly is something that's inequitable or antithetical to equality or equity. And so we started seeing a slew of sports bans across the country, largely targeting trans girls and women, which is interesting actually when you think about it, because there isn't protectionist bills supporting trans men and trans boys in sports. So again, something else to consider, and I'm happy to address that as well. We've also seen categories of healthcare bans that we see probably the most often now, looking at gender affirming care or anti-gender affirming care measures or trans-related medical care. Slowly, we started to see in 2022 creeping of parents' rights bills. An example of that could be if you are a parent and your child and you birthed a cis boy, and that cis boy in school started using she, her pronouns. Many of the laws started to mandate those teachers to tell parents that their child started using pronouns that were quote unquote different than their gender presentation or different than how they may have been born, which is harmful for a number of reasons. And then, of course, one of the last categories was censorship. So these don't say gay, don't say trans bills that popped up all over the country last year, especially, particularly from January to April, which for those who may know a lot about state legislative sessions, and a lot of sessions wrap up in March and April. And so a lot of the bills were pre-filed starting at the end of 2021 and then led into 2022. This year, this year, 2023, what is time? This year, we are seeing over 540 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced in state legislatures. And that's a record number, as we may suspect. Over 220 of those bills specifically target trans and non-binary people, which is also a record. And 45 of those anti-LGBTQ bills, unfortunately, so far have passed, have been enacted, I should say. And so those laws that have been enacted are a range of issues. So there can be laws banning gender affirming care for trans youth. That's been about 13 of them. We have laws requiring or allowing misgendering of trans students, about 3 of those. We have laws targeting drag performances. We have 2 of those. Laws creating a very broad license to discriminate, which are usually rooted in um, Judeo-Christian or white evangelical values, and that's been about 3 so far. And then laws censoring school curriculum, including books. Again, book bans, as we largely have been seeing, and that's been about 2 of them. So we've seen record numbers this year, many of which the numbers this year or actually have been introduced actually are more than 5. If you add up the last 5 years, the numbers this year have already outweighed the last 5 years combined. And there's specific reasons for that. Next slide, please. So there are notable trends that we're seeing this year. As noted, in comparison to other years, there have been more anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in state houses as compared to the past 5 years, with an increase of LGBTQ plus erasure bills. So when you really think about erasure bills, just think of bills that are attempting to erode history. We're also seeing this happen, of course, with efforts related to diversity, equity, and inclusion and critical race theory. And those are specifically happening in many of the same states. They're targeting the same communities. And so we're really seeing those form of attacks happening. The new is the old, and the old is certainly the new. And again, there are also specifics of anti-LGBTQ bills that we're seeing. So more than 125 of those bills will prevent trans youth from being able to access age-appropriate, medically necessary, and best practiced healthcare, meaning healthcare that has actually been stated as a good and something that's actually warranted and needed in many instances from medical doctors, right? And so a lot of this is a violation of conversations that parents are having with doctors and their children's doctors, because lawmakers find it more important or acceptable to know more than medical doctors who went to schools for years. And oftentimes think like, wow, how offended would we as lawyers be, right? As we often are, when it's non-lawyers attempting to tell us things about the law. Right, there are certain communities and professions where people understand, have signed oaths to make sure that they are swearing by best practice and standards of care. And then harmful states. This is just a small number, but we have seen the highest numbers in these specific states, mostly Florida, North Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas. Of course, many people are fighting to be the worst. And so, these are only a few states on here who have the highest numbers, but rest assured, there is now a trend or a battle, particularly when we're coming on legislative years and election years, of why states sometimes, or governors sometimes, become worse than they usually or ordinarily have been. Next slide, please. And this is just for context setting, right? 2018, we saw 41 anti-LGBTQ bills. Keep in mind the number right now is about 550. 2018, we've seen 41 introduced. 2019, we saw 60 introduced. 2020 was a little bit tricky to count, I think, for obvious reasons related to the pandemic. And then 2021 was 250 anti-LGBTQ bills be introduced. Now we've seen more than 550. There are many forces at play there, and I think it's really important to name those forces at play. And these are just, again, small facets of them and very that's factors. But we have seen a groundswell Christian nationalist movement that have really come through that's actually funding a lot of these movements, coupled with far-right extremism, billion-dollar funding attached to it, and a notion of respectability politics, in that a binary system, this, boy, girl, man, woman, one or two, rigidity has really played, and it's really working overtime, I should say, in states across the country. Next slide, please. There is some good news and bad news. I mean, the good news is that, most of the bills failed to become law, though they are introduced. The bad news is there are bills, of course, that are still becoming law, and it creates a narrative and harmful messaging, whether they pass or not, around who these communities are. And so, next slide, please. There is a potential harm of messaging, as we oftentimes see. One more slide, please. So, to quote Malcolm X, the media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent, and that's power because they control the minds of the masses. One more, please. Really important to note because if you've just taken a step back to look at the media's narrative, most of the narrative is really about regurgitating the harm that we're seeing, right? Not what are solutions, how do we do this, what are LGBTQ people doing wrong. There's actually been a lot of photoshops happening of like children being at these very explicit or lewd shows that are just inaccurate and quite frankly just false. But it shapes media's narrative and perceptions of specific communities. So we know certain things have caused harm, right? We know gun violence, suicide, interpersonal and physical harm, bullying, discriminatory case law have caused harm. But there are specific things depending on which outlets we're reviewing, depending on who we're following, of who has actually caused harm and what is causing harm, from drag queens or shows to critical race theory to gender affirming care to books like The Bluest Eye or All Boys Aren't Blue. There's even some who've blamed Beyonce's Renaissance as things that are actually causing harm to communities. And so it's really important to note what side of history are we following, what messaging are we paying attention to, which messaging is not being paid attention to that we actually need more of. Next slide, please. And so, as I conclude, I really want to discuss ways to take action, ways to support LGBTQ youth, and then, of course, happy to answer any questions you all may have. Next slide, please, as I go through a few bullet points of things that we can do. It is certainly, a conception. We can conceptualize what we're going to do as lawyers, law students, legal professionals. But I think something that's not on here that I do want to underscore is the importance of really challenging case law, the importance of really challenging what we see. And it takes time, right? I'm doing tons of research right now on confinement settings and healthcare insurance for young people who are experiencing serious mental illnesses. You don't just like take the case to court because you're angry, right? There are decades of jurisprudence. You have to review it, research it, figure out what makes sense. Is this the right court? Is this the right circuit, right? Like there are a lot of dynamics at play so you don't do damage for decades long, right? And so that is something I want to say to law students, to legal professionals, always keep, and this is not to say be risk averse. Challenge the profession, challenge the law, and be very mindful and thoughtful who could be negatively impacted if you don't, right? That is something to always remember to keep in mind. So a lot of that leads to educating ourselves, right? If you are a heterosexual person or a cisgender person or a white person who wants to help Black and Brown communities, just educate yourself, right? Know that solidarity begins with education. I oftentimes discuss in presentations, right, there are differences between allyship and really co-conspiratorship or accomplishship. And in many ways, allyship is something that many of us, if you notice, who especially folks who are Black and queer and Black and trans push back on, because many people treat ally to be a noun when it's a verb. There's an action attached to what it means to be an ally. Sometimes it means relinquishing your own power so people can actually have power. Sometimes it means not being on a panel and recommending your Black or brown colleague. There are many ways to take action that is more than just actually taking up space. So remember, allyship is an action word. It's a verb. It is not just a thing you are. And also, it's important to know that you don't get to define what communities you ally for. The communities that you ally for tell you whether you are an ally. But we can all say we're allies. I can always say I'm an ally to something. But how do you get to define that you're an ally if the communities that you claim to support don't define that you're an ally? Something to always think about. Always to that point, it's important to listen and learn from others' experiences. People are the experts of their own experiences, right? They don't have to have ESQ behind their name, JD, LLM, PhD. People are the experts of their own experiences. So even without our largely paid for and loan induced degrees, and we know that obstacle and that hurt. It's really important to know that we don't know more than the communities who actually have the highest stake of being harmed by particular laws and policies. That leads me to speak up when we see injustices happening. I know sometimes it can be challenging, it can be hard, but there's nothing that's more frustrating than people who have told me that they've spoken up for me when I'm not in a room, but who are silent when I'm in a room. And so you have to always get comfortable with making spaces uncomfortable, especially when you know that you experience more privilege than other communities. That leads me to largely support marginalized communities. Do you have a budget to pay for marginalized communities? Are you even thinking about that? Are we asking people for free labor? Right? There are other ways to take action to support LGBTQ youth. And of course, build coalitions. Coalitions are the messiest, most beautiful thing that you will see because it's many communities of people of all races, ethnicities, sexual orientation backgrounds, gender identities, socioeconomic statuses who are getting together to achieve a specific goal or a set of goals. And there's always going to be disagreements. But the only way we can actually achieve angelic troublemaking together is by getting in the mess and the beauty of those coalitions. I believe that is my last slide. Hopefully the next one is a thank you slide, so it's not that awkward. Yes, okay. So thank you all so much for your time and attention. And as Jackie stated earlier, I'm so happy to answer any questions you all may have for me.
Thank you so much. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And first person I saw is Professor, let's see, who? Professor Bradley, go ahead. You have the floor.
Hi there. First of all, I just want to thank you for speaking today. I thought it was fantastic. We're actually going to New York, so I wrote down the Stonewall Inn so we can go to that. I mean, I kind of knew about it generally, but I'm going to take my kids to see it in a few weeks.
Good.
But one thing that I really struggle with, like, I'll just give you a quick anecdote. When I was golfing last week with some friends, and I told them that my daughter is bisexual, and she's 15, so she's a freshman in high school. And they're all like, "Oh my gosh, every kid is gay or something." You know, they kind of dismissed it like it's this trend,
Right.
and there's all this. They're more like identifying in a different way so they can be cool. It's just this very dismissive
Right.
attitude about it. And so I said something along the lines of, you know, until you're in their shoes, how can you really like decide that for them?
Mhm.
But they just kind of laughed at it, and there's some data to kind of back this up where the Pew Research poll said like 20% of Gen Zers are identifying, you know, LGBTQ plus,
Mhm.
you know, where generations before that it was closer to 5%. So definitely more kids are comfortable with identifying. So what I'm asking is like, what are some arguments or things I can say to my golf buddies who are like so dismissive
Yeah.
of people's like, I mean, this is their identity. This is the core of who they are. And they're just like, whatever.
Yeah.
What can I say?
Yeah, no, I love this question. So first of all, you're going to have an interesting Saturday at golf. But I but I think there are many things you can say. Frankly, just because this is an argument we hear often. I mean, this is actually, if I had to rank top three, this is one of the top three. The reality is, I mean, I'm glad you cited Pew because the reality is we do have situations where young people are identifying more as LGBTQ. It doesn't mean that we have more LGBTQ young people, though. Right? There's this oftentimes this dynamic that because people are saying something more, then it must be more happening as opposed to maybe people feel more comfortable. Maybe there's a safer space that they see created. Maybe there is like we talk about therapy more, right? Like it's almost as if identifying like I go to therapy, but none of my family who's older than 40 have ever gone to therapy a day in their life. And so it's like if we actually took that, does that mean that problems didn't exist for people to go to therapy just because they didn't go? No, it's because we're having these conversations more publicly. There is like these notions of sensitivities and vulnerabilities and what that looks like. We have GSAs, or, gender and sexuality alliances. We have Pride that's actually more visible for many people to see and support. And this happens often, right? We have situations, of course, where it's hard to look at trends and understand what's really happening. So, for example, during Me Too, when we saw a lot of things happening related to Me Too, we saw reports of sexual assault and rape skyrocket, right? Does that mean that rape is happening more? We don't know, right? We just know that people feel a space where their voices can actually and finally be heard, for them to actually say something. Now, the reality is this: that may not work for your golf buddies, right? So oftentimes I say, why does it matter if there is someone who is doing this to be cool? Sexuality is the spectrum. They're going to figure it out on their terms anyway. I am here to help support them in figuring out whatever that looks like for them, right? And so that's just the reality of some of the things you can say. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But also, I do have to challenge when people say it feels like a fad or a trend, because who is that harming? Even if we want to take that argument, who is that harming? It's not harming anyone, unless the harm that you see is we're now at a straight people deficit, right? It doesn't harm anyone. And so that's just the reality of it. It doesn't work for everyone, but I have realized when you do a quick, do you hear yourself moment, people suddenly start to swallow and realize that they actually kind of sound quite silly.
Thank you. We have
Thank you.
a question in the chat. What message would you give to parents of children that have not come out yet?
Oh goodness, I love this question. You know, I said something I think probably controversial. Probably missed several things. But one time in particular on social media, I remember struggling with something, and it was around people. It was around National Coming Out Day, but it was around like this idea that a lot of people's first response to when queer people come out or invite in is, "Oh, we knew." And I think it's not like malicious, right? I think it's genuinely people just trying to actually level set or like cut some of the tension, remove some of the tension rather. But my response to things like that are, well, if you knew, what did you do to make me feel safe? If you knew, what did you do to make me feel seen? You knew, right? You weren't questioning it, you knew. And so I think there are many things that parents and guardians and caregivers can do without forcing a conversation of sexuality. And I think sometimes it's as simple as, what are you playing in your home? Do you play anything that have a queer character in it? Do you buy books with queer people? Do you like share those ideas? Do you openly just say things like, I really hate this environment that LGBTQ people can't feel seen? Right? Like, how are you dictating some of those conversations and responses? And I think the more young people hear it, they want to talk about it. They really do. Most of my work has been in youth advocacy, whether it's been abortion access, sex ed, or LGBTQ health equities. And I have found that young people always want to share who they are. They just need a space to feel like you're actually going to be receptive to it and that you're not just going to push back on them. Curiosity is okay, right? But not a pushback. And so that is what I will say. Like, how are you actually showing up in many ways that aren't connected to you just saying, hey, are you LGBTQ? I'll tell this quick anecdote just to kind of firm up this point. I don't think I came out until, why, I know. I came out my senior year in college. And I remember this was at a time where Facebook was like really high, and they had these like really cool things where you can actually say it's Pride Month and I'm X, right? You can fill in the gap. It was like a drop down menu. And this was the same I was on homecoming court in college, and it was happened to be on National Coming Out Day. And so before I went to walk on the homecoming field or the field, I posted like, I am like, it's National Coming Out Day and I'm something. It was clearly something that was so nebulous enough that if you saw, you were like, oh, he gay, right? But I didn't want to say it. So my mom calls me and she's like, hey, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I'm actually literally on the field right now. I gotta go. So she was like, hey, it's okay. I just want to say I love you and good luck. So I went homecoming king. I'm celebrating and I call my mom to tell her. And she says to me, I knew you were going to win. And whenever you want to talk to me about anything you post, just let me know. She didn't say anything, but I knew exactly what she was saying. And before I hung up, I said, Mom, I'm gay. I love you. I'll call you later. And then we had the best conversation the next day. And so I think like, and I know that is a privileging conversation, just to be very clear. But it was at a moment where I felt safe. And I don't think I would have shared that with her if she didn't plant seeds that let me know there was safety there to saying anything to her about it. So brief anecdote that I hope at least firms up that point. But I really do believe there are many things we can say to young people and even our own children.
Thank you, Preston. We have another question in the chat. And the question is, how have you addressed much of the Black church pushback regarding LGBTQ issues?
A lot. Um, a lot. I will say that that is always the trickiest for me in my field. That has been the trickiest part, and not just Black churches, frankly, but I do think that we know that there's a specific dynamic, or at least a popularized dynamic, but that many of us who grew up in Black churches have felt for a long time. Um, and I think like a lot of it has been like decades, centuries old trauma and harm about praying the gay away, or really just an obvious and a more visceral pushback. Like I know many, as we lovingly call them, church queens, who grew up in the church, who love the Lord, but also really love their queerness. And that is something that's obviously for many churches are being violently pushed back against, and are some of the most reprehensible harm doers, quite frankly. And so a lot of this, I mean, I think we can certainly discuss like what love looks like, who love is, but oftentimes really do tend to call out some, especially as someone who grew up in the church, like really tend to call out some of the dynamics of the things that are kind of piecemealed and picked and chosen about what's suddenly good and what's suddenly bad, right? Because for those who've actually read the Bible as they say they do, right, homosexuality is not discussed, right? And there are different notions of what people believe certain things mean, but have actually clearly haven't been proven and can't be for that matter. And so I've always found there are certainly a lot of affirming churches, a lot of Black affirming churches, but depending on where you go. A lot of them are affiliated with like Universalist Unitarian churches. A lot of them are affiliated with community churches. But there's a lot of pushback that many of us who've done like civil rights work at the intersection of racial justice and LGBTQ justice have done. But we have a long way to go. I mean, it's something that we're not going to solve overnight. Obviously, we have not. But I think it's because a lot of it is so interwoven with social, right? We could talk about laws and policies all day, but a lot of what we're also discussing are things that the law can't change, that the law can't shift. And so a lot of it is like, how are we responding socially to these communities? Or quite frankly, like, how are we making sure that we're honoring our own faith-based practices and supporting LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ people and issues? But you know what? I mean, the reality is, there's a lot more conservative nature in the Black church and in Black communities that I think many Black people have not wrestled with and reckoned with. And that is again something that has to be an age-old conversation. But for me, it's actually largely no different than what I see in white evangelical spaces and Christian nationalist spaces. It just happens to be something that I think I'm guessing the person who wrote this question is Black. But for me, at least, is because the community is Black, and I think there is a different like notion of tight knit and communal bonding that you want to stay in that space, even when that space has done you harm. And so there's just a lot there. And but just to answer that question a little bit more directly, that's just some of the ways I've addressed it, is really pushing back on some of the contradictory notions, really reaffirming what faith-based and faith-based practices mean, and really supporting, like, are we supporting communities? Are we not? Are we supporting love, or are we not? Right? Like, who are we actually supporting? And when we're not supporting particular people, who are we ultimately harming?
Thank you. I would like to open up the floor for any questions. And if you use the raised hand feature and unmute, that will be fine. Do we have any questions from our audience members?
And can I ask, I'm sorry, can I just say one more thing as well? And you're welcome. I just want to, I always tell people as well, don't be afraid to find something that's more fitting for you as well. I have walked out of many of churches, and I've done it in the most dramatic way so you can know why I'm walking out. Because I find it really important, right? People may look at you a certain way, but it's like, no, like, this is not a safe space for me. And then, like, it's the same way with therapy. There are some people who think they hate therapy because they've had bad experiences with particular therapists. And I'm like, the idea of therapy is not bad. You have to find a therapist that works for you. Just like, for me at least, there's a difference between, like, religious institutions and God, right? Like, one does not inherently have to equal the other. And you can find safe spaces in God where you may not in certain churches. And you can walk out of certain churches and find ones that are right for you if you don't want to divorce yourself of the institution of churches. So just wanted to add that as well.
Thank you. Do we have any other members of the audience who have a question? Well, we are closing on our time, and I do have a question. Preston, what do you know for sure?
I know about the brilliance of marginalized communities. One of the things that I've seen a lot, and it made me really question a lot during the height of the pandemic in 2020, was we need community more than anyone else. And so, yes, I can't be a contradictory and hypocritical lawyer. Of course, we need laws and policies. Of course, we'll need to push back on some of them to create the world that we want to ultimately see. But the reality is, when people were hungry during the pandemic, we were building mutual aid programs, right? When people needed shelter, people were sheltering folks, right? When things were happening, when we saw upticks of police violence on camera, people were literally getting together and protecting each other from pepper spray. Like, it was, as much as we believe, and we're right about this as well, there's a lot of infighting, but community ultimately saves our day every single time. And so that is what I know for sure, is that irrespective of the laws and policies, irrespective of institutions, we keep us safe all the time. And I want us to remember that in our angriest moments of each other. That all these things are happening, but when you are unhoused, when you are unwell, like, I always remember, when I'm not feeling well, the people who usually look out are not the government, right? It's my partner, it's my friends, it's my neighbors, right? Like, so that's the thing I always, like, that keeps me grounded and going, is like, what I know for sure is community is enough.
Thank you. Well, Preston, thank you so much for sharing time with us this afternoon and educating and encouraging us. And we'd like everybody, please give a warm welcome to Preston for spending time with us this afternoon. Really, really appreciate it. And I'd like to turn it over to our President and Dean, James McGrath, for any closing remarks.
Preston, thank you very much. That was great. I really enjoyed, especially the pre-Stonewall history lesson. People forget about that part, and that was great. And I'm really excited that Brad is going to be going to the Stonewall Inn. Still serving great cocktails, by the way. Thank you very much, Preston, and happy Pride Month, everybody.